Well, for the third time, assisted suicide is on the agenda at the Scottish Parliament. There's been a new consultation launched by McArthur, Lib Dem MSP, and this is the third time it's come around. So this document's been published ready for the consultation. So I'm just going to have a look through it and pick out a few points. I'm not going to really try and get into the nitty-gritty of the main arguments against assisted suicide, but I'm just going to look at some of the points that have come up in this. I mean, this process will go on for many months to come, so there'll be time to look in more detail at some of the specific arguments. But we'll just look at some of the broad points that have been raised here by Liam. I actually debated this issue with Liam in 2013, the last time it was coming forward at the Scottish Parliament. In my overall impression that I wasn't at all sure he was particularly committed to the cause, but it is Lib Dem policy, as it is the policy of the Green Party as well. So I guess the Lib Dems have only got 4 MSPs, so they needed someone to put it forward, and it seems Liam is taking on that responsibility. So let's look at some of the things in this document. Just reading from the foreword. It says, for the purposes of this consultation, assisted dying means the practice whereby a person diagnosed with a terminal illness is given the choice to end their own life by means of medication provided by a doctor. So they call it assisted dying for a start. It obviously more accurately should be called assisted suicide. Now, this whole area is riddled with euphemisms. People don't want to be open about the actual nature of what they're proposing, so they shroud it in euphemisms. So assisted dying, well, that's just misleading, isn't it? It gives the impression that you're assisting people in the process of dying, you're caring for them. Whereas, of course, it's not that. It is assisting suicide, plain and simple. If you provide someone with poison so that they can kill themselves, then the accurate description is assisted suicide. But they don't like to say that. Maybe even their own conscience isn't comfortable with telling it as it is, so the euphemisms come into play. Person diagnosed with a terminal illness. Now, the last bill that came forward, terminal illness was defined with a time period. I think it was someone expected to die within 12 months. But with this one, there's no time limit. So someone could be diagnosed with a terminal illness that's expected to kill them within 10 years or 20 years or whatever. So it's very open-ended. So given a choice to end their own lives by means of medication. If you look at a dictionary definition of medication, a substance that you take in order to kill yourself, that doesn't really come under the definition of medication. That comes very clearly and plainly under the definition of poison. Do they want to use the word poison? No, that doesn't sound so nice, does it? So again, euphemisms come in and they call the poison medication. The current prohibition on such assistance is unjust. Now, how that's unjust? Well, it doesn't really present an argument for that. Again, on such assistance for someone to commit suicide. But the key word there is prohibition. Now, the word prohibition has got negative connotations, hasn't it? If you hear prohibition, what comes to mind? It comes, America, was it 1930s when they tried to ban alcohol and it didn't work and it was generally a disaster. So that's what comes to mind when people hear prohibition. So if ever there's a law that people want to get rid of, or something that people want to make legal that's currently illegal, they'll call it a prohibition. It's just a rhetorical trick. It's got no content. So that's the trick he's trying there. I mean, these tricks to an intelligent audience should have no power at all. People should just see straight through them. But in the Scottish Parliament, who knows how much weight they will carry. So it says this will only apply to terminally ill, mentally competent adults. So the doctors approving this, providing the poison to people, they must be confident the person is mentally competent. They're capable of making their own decisions. But I was thinking with that though, how long can that last? What about when you have the person who's not mentally competent, who is also suffering unbearably, they might say? Surely it's unfair to say to them, no, you have to keep living because you're not mentally competent. How long before people are saying, well, you know, why can't they have the right to poison themselves as well? Now, of course, usually if someone's not mentally competent, what happens? Then the decision-making power passes to someone else. either to professionals or family members, etc. So that's the usual case for everything else in life, basically. So why should not that be the case here as well? So I think it's inevitable that there's this restriction for mentally competent adults currently, but just by straightforward logic, it will extend to adults who are not competent as well, because that's the way we operate on every other issue. Someone else makes a decision on their behalf. Now it says adults. Why should it not apply to children? Do children have to have this unbearable suffering without the relief of being able to poison themselves? Why should children's rights be denied? Children's rights, that's a hot button in the Parliament, isn't it? They all go down the line of children's rights. That's a really top priority. Already, 12-year-olds and upwards have got the right to make any medical decisions, so why haven't they got the right to make this one? I mean, the case is just there waiting for someone to make it, isn't it? So the slippery slope is real. It will soon not just be terminally ill, it won't just be mentally competent, it won't just be adults, it will extend and extend and extend. Through the application of logic, once the principles conceded that suicide is an acceptable response, state-assisted suicide is an acceptable response to illness, then it will logically extend through all of those stages. Now it says the bill will have strong safeguards. Now I'm not sure what it's got in mind in terms of safeguards, but a lot of the problem with assisted suicide, I mean, one problem is just the fundamental moral problem, but the other problem is the culture of pressure and responsibility to die that people might start to feel. Even if it's not actually there, people might start feeling that other people were wishing or feeling they had a duty to, or it would be fairer to them to commit suicide. What safeguards can you have against that? Well, you can't. As simple as that. You cannot have safeguards against that. But in these sort of campaigners, they often say, you know, we can put safeguards in place to avoid all of these dangers. But they can't. They can't. It's just impossible. So this bill is offering transparency, protection, and compassion. Well, we dispute those terms when it's basically describing a doctor prescribing poison to patients. It says that similar legislation has passed rigorous testing in other countries. Now, how this is rigorously tested, I really don't know. If he's meaning that the people who get poisoned really die, then yes, okay, this has been tested. In terms of its wider effects in society, well, some very concerning effects have emerged in other countries. I'll touch on those a little bit later on. So Liam says, it's a proposal that chimes with the powers of our Parliament. It's a proposal that chimes with the powers our Parliament has to deliver change that will help build a fairer and more progressive society. Everything's got to be fairer. What does that word mean in this context? It's difficult to see. More progressive. I mean, to describe something as progressive, that's not an argument by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, roughly, in terms of moral positions, there's a progressive side of a lot of arguments, and there's a traditional or morally conservative side of a lot of arguments. But it seems to be suggesting that the purpose of the Scottish Parliament is to push in the so-called progressive direction. And he feels able to put that as an argument within this document, but it just isn't an argument. He then says, you know, emerging from the pandemic, this is the time to do it. But what's the pandemic got to do with anything? It's like back in the millennium, that the soundbite was, as we move into the new millennium, we need to do whatever the person wants to happen. So it's the same here, emerging from the pandemic. Meaningless, no relevance at all to what we're dealing with here. So it says we have the ability to create a new standard for how we die. A new standard, yes, a lower moral standard, I would argue. Assisted dying also featured in political parties' manifestos. It did. It's the policy of the Lib Dems and the Greens. They're the foremost parties of death in Scotland. The others compete pretty closely, but they're the foremost promoters of the culture of death, with commitments to explore the issue in this session of Parliament. That was the SNP manifesto. The SNP manifesto basically said we will bring this issue forward for it to be debated, which is obviously a move in the direction of legalizing assisted suicide. I mean, if you want to open up the debate, then you're opening up the possibility. It's like saying the SNP say we want an independence referendum because they want the change that it could result in. So if you say we want to bring forward assisted suicide legislation or debate, consultation, then obviously that's with a view to achieving the end that it could lead to. Liam says, I know from my own mailbag that the demand for change is growing. It is indeed. I mean, the BBC have been cheerleaders for assisted suicide for a decade or two, at least. The other media as well are very sympathetic to it. They tend to run stories about brave people who commit suicide, very emotional stories, but they don't explore the arguments against it in anything like the same way. So yeah, public opinion has shifted in favour of it. But I do believe that's because a lot of people haven't really heard the other side of the argument. And throughout this consultation and this parliamentary process, probably a lot of people still are not going to hear the other side of the argument. But we will do what we can. Now, Liam refers to the previous bills put forward in the Parliament, and he says, they've shown that an outright prohibition does not work. So the previous two bills that were defeated in the Parliament have somehow demonstrated that having assisted suicide as illegal doesn't work. I mean, in what sense has it been demonstrated that it doesn't work? Again, I don't see any rational argument in that at all. So we cannot continue to tolerate a situation where the options open to people at the end of life are so limited. Again, it's as if even Liam doesn't want to call a spade and use the actual words referring to accurately to what he is proposing. I understand that some people hold different views, but ask that they consider the issue in the light of the evidence and the actual proposals put forward here. Yes, we will certainly do that. This is a progressive reform. Again, it says that as though it's an argument. It's a descriptive word of a moral perspective. It's not an argument. And puts in place safeguards where none currently exist. Well, of course you don't need safeguards at the moment because it isn't legal. So bringing in something that's very dangerous with safeguards is not as good as keeping it off the agenda completely. So in that sense, it's a protective measure, he says, and we've got double think at the extreme here. It makes the common point that at the moment people with lots of money can afford to go to Switzerland to be killed there. But that's a poor argument for a legalization of anything. If something's illegal in one country, there will often be another country where it is legal. So if you want to smoke cannabis, you could go to Amsterdam. I mean, frankly, don't bother because the police completely ignore it here and you can't walk around Edinburgh for half an hour without smelling cannabis. But in theory, if you want to smoke cannabis legally, you go to Amsterdam. If you want to drive your car at 100 miles an hour, go to Germany. Okay? So that's generally the way with laws, is if you want to do something that's illegal in one country, sometimes you can go to another country. That is not an argument in any way against making anything illegal. If you take that argument, that's the lowest common denominator argument, isn't it? It's effectively saying anything that's legal anywhere around the world should be legal here too. Otherwise, there's the injustice. The people who can afford to go to that other country can do the thing, but people who can't afford can't do it, and that's unfair. So it's the lowest common denominator argument. Right, just a couple of things from the text of the bill. So this definition of terminal illness, it does say, which can reasonably be expected to cause their death over any time frame. So that's a very flexible definition. The person must be over 16 years of age in order to request the poison to poison themselves. Again, everything else in Scottish law, so children's rights culture says that age should be 12. So as soon as this would be passed, there'll be people saying it needs to go down to 12. Let's see what happens. And people need to have been resident in Scotland for at least 12 months. I mean, when? The 12 months before they request this? That's not at all clear as well, but that's a minor point. Right, the safeguards, allegedly, what process has to be gone through before the healthcare professional knocks on your door to deliver poison to you for you to kill yourself. It says 2 doctors assess that the person is making an informed decision without pressure or coercion. Right, 2 doctors, what does that remind you of? That reminds me of the process for abortion, which initially was supposed to meet some quite stringent demands, but very quickly just became basically most doctors will just sign off on anything that's just abortion on demand. So we're not necessarily confident the doctors are going to apply whatever standards there are rigorously. But it says without pressure or coercion. How does a doctor know? How does a doctor know whether someone's feeling, I think my family are probably feeling it's time to go. They're having to drive all that distance to keep visiting me. Being in this care home, it's eating through the inheritance. They're probably thinking I should go. How are doctors supposed to assess that? They can't. Once this culture's been introduced, then it's pervasive and it's unstoppable. There's no protection against it. So doctors cannot make that judgment. So the poison will be stored at a pharmacy. I would suggest that there might be some risk of misuse, criminal malpractice there at some point, but that risk is going to be taken. This is a key thing. A healthcare professional brings the medication, checks the person continues to retain their capacity and a settled intention to die, and remains present. The person must administer the life-ending medication, poison in other words, themselves. Now, I think there's a pretty crucial thing there. The healthcare professional remains present. But what exactly happens? Do they check that they're dead? I mean, that would seem the sensible thing. But again, it seems in this document that they don't want to actually spell out what's involved. They don't want to explain that they deliver the poison, help the person to take it, and then check that they're actually dead, and then carry the process on from there. That's the bit that's, it's a bit grisly. It's distasteful, to say the least. You think about the person having to do this, the so-called healthcare professional. That sounds maybe a bit traumatic, upsetting, emotionally difficult. So they just don't mention that bit. And it's not clear what's supposed to happen. So does this person remain present while they drink the poison? Do they then get in their car and drive off? Are the relatives are left to see if they die or not? Then they can phone the doctor if they think they're not quite dead. Or do they phone someone else to check they're dead? I mean, in terms of this process, this is a pretty fundamental, crucial element of it, isn't it? This is something you'd really need to nail and make sure is clear. I said, but they deliberately skip over it because it's unsavory, and they worry it might put people off the bill if they talk about the actual nitty-gritty of how it would work. Now, it talks about the current law. I wasn't aware of this, actually. In England and Wales, it's a crime to encourage or assist suicide, but that's not a crime in Scotland. I was quite surprised to learn that. My first response is, well, I think it should be. I think it should be. For various reasons, partly because of the culture and what it communicates. If you've got someone encouraging people to commit suicide, people who are depressed or at very difficult stages in their life, vulnerable to influence for various reasons, then I think someone going around with a message, I think committing suicide is a good option. I'll help you to commit suicide. Come to my centre and I'll help you. Then I think that's something that's very dangerous. So I think a law that does make it legal to encourage or assist suicide would be a good move. I think as the Scottish Family Party, that's something we might consider adding to our policies. There's a section in here about public opinion. It says 87% of the public back the introduction of an assisted dying law. I think that's a great sentence because it really lays bare what's going on here. 80% of the Scottish public back the introduction of an assisted dying law. Assisted dying. That's really misleading. So in other words, when we ask a really misleading question, we can get 87% of the public backing this. But I understand, I'll maybe look into this more thoroughly in a future video, that when people are presented with some of the arguments against assisted suicide, this level of support goes right down. So it says that support for assisted suicide is very high among supporters of the SNP, Labour, Conservatives, Lib Dems. I suggest it's very low among supporters of the Scottish Family Party, because this is one of our central policies relating to our pro-life theme. It says 82% of religious people support the change. Now, I've got my doubts about that statistic. But anyway, he quotes religious luminaries such as Richard Holloway, the former Bishop of Edinburgh, who spent his career denying Christian doctrines left, right and centre. I mean, whether he believes in God is very debatable. Also mentions the Reverend Scott McKenna of the Church of Scotland. I've actually debated with Scott McKenna, quite a charming gentleman. I would say he doesn't believe in God in the traditional sense at all. But still, if you can find one Church of Scotland minister, that's worth including in the evidence, isn't it? I mean, it's a pretty low bar to get yourself included in this argument. Right, there's been a fundamental shift in opinion amongst healthcare professionals. There has been a shift. But do we trust the healthcare professions to give us moral guidance? Sadly, the answer is no, we don't. No, we don't. Look at the track record. Look at the record on abortion. Look at other issues relating to end of life as well. Looking at the transgender so-called treatments issues. I think there are areas where the medical profession has gone seriously off the rails morally. In a sense, why should we expect otherwise? Okay, they've got the experience of caring for people, but in terms of the deeper philosophical arguments relating to this, should we expect doctors to be to have more wisdom and understanding of these than other people? Well, to a degree, but society is shifting and the medical profession is getting drawn along with it. Also, a lot of the medics, nurses, etc., who are involved in these professional associations making these decisions, they're activists. They enter these professional associations and get involved with a view to shifting policies in the direction that reflects their own cultural, philosophical, political leanings. And they're very influential in that regard. So, but in terms of looking at the medical profession for moral guidance, I think we don't need to look past the issue of abortion to see that the medical profession isn't the touchstone of moral wisdom within these ethical areas. It says here that doctors are most trusted in the Netherlands. I'm sure someone has done some research somewhere that's shown that doctors are most trusted in the Netherlands. But I've also heard in the Netherlands that some people carry a card because they're worried to go to hospital, because they're worried basically that they might be killed by the doctors. So they carry a card saying, I don't want to die. I do not want euthanasia, because they're worried that that's what might happen to them in hospital. Right, protecting vulnerable people. Potentially vulnerable groups of people, such as those in lower socioeconomic status or aged over 85, do not disproportionately use assisted dying laws. This is always fascinating. In the Scottish Parliament, any proposed bill has to have these sort of equality assessments, because as far as the Scottish Parliament is concerned, in general, that's the idea of morality. If it's 50% men, 50% women, equally distributed through socio-economic groups, equally distributed through races, then it's fine. The fact that it's suicide, which is very morally problematic, shall we say, to say the least, all the other issues, they don't matter so much, so long as it's equally distributed across different groups, then it's okay. So they're saying here, potentially vulnerable groups of people, such as those of lower socioeconomic status or over 85, do not disproportionately use assisted dying laws. Over 85? I mean, what's the significance of over 85 compared to over 75 or whatever? But I won't try and go into this because the whole line of argument is just completely vacuous. There's nothing there worth considering at all. I've got another section here. This is talking about evidence from some research in other countries. And it says, empirical evidence from experts within the jurisdictions where the practice is legal, such as Oregon, Netherlands, Belgium, is that there's no so-called slippery slope. Right, how it comes to that conclusion, I cannot possibly imagine, because the number of assisted suicides and euthanasias in the Netherlands and Belgium has skyrocketed. So I'll go into this in more detail in the coming months, but it's skyrocketed. also the extensions to more and more groups has happened exactly the way that I suggested it would. In Belgium, to the point that there's now no age limit on euthanasia. So any child who expresses a desire to die, if they decide that that child's capable of making that decision, they understand it, then that will be carried out. There have been stories from Belgium and the Netherlands of people who've been euthanized because they were depressed, tired of life, they lost their sense of hearing or whatever. I mean, really, really sad stories that you read and just think, if that option wasn't there for them, surely they could have been supported to a fulfilling life in the future. So how he says the slippery slope is so called, I do not know. Just on the point of slippery slope, just to go into that a little bit more, there are three sorts of slippery slope. People often think a slippery slope argument is just a bad sort of argument. It's like saying, if you don't polish your shoes, then you'll end up living in the gutter, because it's just like one thing leads to another, one thing leads to another, and your life will end up in a total mess because you don't make the effort to polish your shoes. People tend to think of that sort of thing as a slippery slope argument. But there are actually three forms of slippery slope argument that are actually perfectly good. All right, the first one is an empirical slippery slope argument, which is where you look at something and say, right, let's see where this has been implemented and let's see what happens. So if you can say everywhere where this has been implemented, this is what happened next, then this happened next, and this happened next, then that's a valid argument. And that's valid in this case. If you look at particularly Belgium and the Netherlands, then you'll see that empirical slippery slope. That is what's happened. Then you can look at a philosophical slippery slope, which is where you look at the argument that's put forward and look at its logical conclusions. So if someone says people should be able to end their lives if they want to in response to a real difficulty, once you concede that point, then that same logic leads to extension after extension. Because people say, why should we be excluded from this right to die? Why should we have to keep on living? And every group that comes along with this case, their case is valid, so it extends and extends. There's a logical slippery slope. And the last sort of slippery slope is a psychological slippery slope, which is as soon as the culture changes, then that change in culture leads to other effects. So with assisted suicide, as soon as you change the culture within a society, so that suicide, instead of being something that's tragic and to be discouraged, becomes something that's seen as a perfectly valid option. In fact, it's a brave and noble option. In fact, it's the option that some people ought to take in certain circumstances. It's the brave option in some circumstances. Therefore, some people who don't commit suicide, that must be the cowardly option. So this culture change is going to have an effect as well. So again, that's quite rational to refer to that as a slippery slope. Now again, there's more detail here about this prescribing and delivering. So it says the healthcare professional present may then prepare the medicine, poison, for self-administration by that person. The healthcare professional must be present when the person takes the poison. The attending healthcare professional should then complete the follow-up form. Again, you can see this clearly missing out the crucial step. Do they check they're dead? Is this follow-up form to record death? Or is it just to record that they've taken the poison? So the crucial thing is omitted for basically rhetorical reasons. Then it says death certificates are public documents, and in the interest of privacy, the primary cause of death would be noted as the underlying illness from which the person died. So you've got someone who's been diagnosed with a terminal condition. This may be, they're predicted to die in 10 years' time. Instead, they choose to poison themselves. So the NHS provides the poison, and they kill themselves with the NHS poison. And on the death certificate, it says they died of the illness that was expected to kill them in 10 years' time. Now, my problem with that is just that it's a lie. It's just not true. I don't think public documents should record lies for any reason at all. But, well, Liam seems to think that's what should happen. Right, terminal illness is defined for the purpose of providing social security as that suffering suffered by those who are deemed by doctors to be unable to recover, regardless of the time they have left to live. This restriction to terminal illness, again, of course, that border is never going to hold. What about the person who's got an illness that's not terminal? Surely their case is stronger for assisted suicide, because someone who's expected to die in 6 months, they're going to be delivered allegedly from 6 months of suffering. If someone that there's no expectation they're going to die of the condition, but it's causing them anguish in some form, surely they've got a stronger case. So the fact that it says for terminally ill, that border, it's indefensible, that condition. That border will always fall, that barrier will always fall in the future once the principle is conceded. It's important that doctors and other healthcare professionals are able to conscientiously object to supporting their patients through an assisted dying request. I'm really not at all happy with that wording. So in other words, some doctors and healthcare professionals will refuse to support their patients. They sound like pretty nasty, uncaring people. Refuse to support their patients through an assisted dying request. In other words, they won't help them to implement their own suicide, would be a more straightforward way of expressing that. Now, the conscience thing, okay, they're saying that there can be conscientious objection, but there will be pressure. If you're the pharmacist, if you're the only person on duty and you're refusing to do it, you're going to be a bit of a nuisance. Or if you're the doctor in the practice who won't do it, let's say there's 3 doctors in the practice, 2 of them won't do it, and you're recruiting a new doctor, you've really got to get someone who'll do assisted suicide, haven't you? So it's going to count against some people in their careers, one way or another, which is very unfair, but I feel inevitable. There's a quote from someone here. It says, appealing to the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, this person has said that people with disabilities deserve access to assisted dying. People with disabilities deserve access to assisted dying. Now, again, human rights, as I say, they mean what people want them to mean, and people just declare that what they want is a human right. And often the United Nations interprets the rights to mean all sorts of things that's not in the text. So he's talking about a right of assisted dying for disabled people. That's another way it would extend. If you have to take the poison yourself, what about someone who can't actually do that? Why should they be denied the right to assisted suicide? I mean, surely they should be able to have euthanasia if they're not capable of doing it themselves. The doctor should kill them for them. Again, the logic says that the fair thing would be to extend it to those people. Now, we're talking about disabled people, so people with a disability, so not an illness necessarily, a disability even. So you can see just extension, extension, extension. The slippery slope is apparent even within this document. Right, the equality assessment, gender. Research has shown that a lack of choice at the end of life disproportionately and detrimentally affects men. Now, I'm only joking. I mean, there's zero probability that anything ever disproportionately affects men. Inevitably, like everything else under the sun, as far as the Scottish Parliament is concerned, detrimentally affects women, who continue to be the primary caregivers at the end of life. So one way or another, they've worked out that women are currently most harmed by the illegality of assisted suicide. I mean, how that's worked out, I cannot imagine, but it's just standard, because women allegedly are at the worst end of everything. I just thought about this point a little bit overnight, and maybe I've got something to add here. There's a link to a website for this comment, and I looked at the article on the website. It's pretty waffly, it wasn't quite clear what it was saying, but I think I can see underneath the point they're getting at, and it's something like this. Basically, if you think about wives and husbands, for example, it's more common for a wife to be looking after a husband through his final months than vice versa, just basically because women tend to live longer is one of the reasons. So I think what they're saying here is women are going to have to be looking after ill partners more because they can't currently commit suicide instead. I think that seems to be what's underneath this point. So the Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland have opposed previous attempts to legislate in this area. The Catholic Church will certainly oppose it again. I would hope the Church of Scotland would as well. This is quite an interesting issue in terms of the religious perspective, because assisted suicide isn't that hot a topic. And if you're an MSP in the Scottish Parliament, let's say you're a Catholic, say, and there's a debate on assisted suicide, you could stand up and really give a strong speech against assisted suicide, and your career is intact. You're not going to be called anything phobic or whatever. Your career could still advance reasonably well. It's not like a lot of other issues where if you put forward a traditional moral perspective, I mean, your career is finished. So it'll be interesting. You hear some people in the Parliament being a lot more forthright than they are on issues where there would be a price to pay for defending what they really believe. Right, it says the members pursuing this bill proposal in the belief that the current law does not fully respect people's rights to control the timing and manner of their own deaths and their right to a dignified death. Again, the idea of a right, they just pluck it from thin air. You've got whatever they want becomes a right. That's the way it gets talked about. But I really object to this term, the right to a dignified death. For the suggestion is someone who dies experiencing some maybe very difficult suffering in the final stage of their life, that is some way undignified. Is that what you're trying to say, Liam? Now, of course, if Liam were here, we'd say, oh no, I didn't mean that at all. That's not what I mean. Well, I would say, if it's not what you mean, then don't say it. Because that's clearly what you are suggesting there, which I would suggest is, well, I would say it's very offensive to some people. It's just wrong. Right, resource implications. Evidence from countries where assisted dying is legalized suggests that the implementation of assisted dying will remain at least cost neutral. At least. Well, obviously, anyone with any sense will realize that as far as the NHS is concerned, this will probably be a money saver. If you've got people who are facing months or years of serious illness, then if they can just be prescribed some poison to kill themselves, then overall it's going to be a cost saver. He doesn't say that explicitly, but it's clearly implied by what he's saying. The small print at the bottom of the page is the thing that came out in the media a little bit. This consultation with two doctors, it says it could be overtaken by a video link. You could do it on Zoom if there's a difficulty finding doctors who will undertake those consultations, particularly in rural areas. The idea that you can have this discussion over the internet, again, is quite shocking, I suggest. So there, that's just a little look at what's been proposed. This argument will run and run. I'll look into some of the more nitty-gritty arguments against assisted suicide over the coming months. I would say there are people who are supporting the family party very strongly, but this would be an issue where they'd say, oh no, we're not quite with you on this one, don't quite get it on this one. I could probably understand that, because the full range of arguments against assisted suicide are very rarely heard. So over the next few months, I'd like to bring some of them out, and hopefully those of you who are supporters of the family party are perhaps thinking, that you didn't quite get it on this issue, perhaps your thinking will move along a little bit when you hear some of the arguments. So hopefully that's interesting. As I say, the Scottish Family Party, pro-life is one of our absolutely core non-negotiable principles, and assisted suicide is one of the areas where we apply that. But at the end of the day, no matter what the practical consequences are, I just think the fact of assisting someone to kill themselves is just wrong. It's just wrong. And when something's wrong, it has negative consequences. So we can argue about the negative consequences, and we certainly will, put forward the evidence in that regard. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of you will agree with me that just your conscience says to you that that's wrong. So that's something that we shouldn't go down. Our society will be degraded, morally degraded, if this becomes part of the government's activity. Now, in terms of your conscience, some people say, oh, that's just a feeling, it's just irrational. You can't go around trusting your conscience. You've got to look at the rational arguments. Well, in a way, that's not entirely true, because no rational argument gets off the ground in terms of morality without starting with the conscience. That's where it all starts. So if you think don't harm people unnecessarily, that's not the conclusion of an argument. That's just something that your conscience tells you. Our conscience is the ultimate, well, one of the ultimate founts of our moral judgment. So I think if your conscience says doctors delivering poison for people to kill themselves, just your conscience says, no, that is just not right. Don't let anyone demean that. Don't let anyone convince you that you should ignore that because that's somehow invalid. Because everyone else who's talking about morality, that's where they're starting from as well. The voice of conscience is crucial, and we listen to it. Okay, thanks for watching. Goodbye.